to see him as trying to call himself king, or sort of act like king. The insight really is looking at the government of the Guardians, the originally 7, soon to be 6 Guardians who were elected on 29th April 1286 to run the country for, until we could get a new king. And all we have here is an inventory of the of the administration of the records generated under the Guardians. And what is significant there is that it's amazingly detailed, although it's just an inventory. And I've given you a summary of it, and we don't have time, obviously, to look at that in detail. I just want to say it is amazingly detailed. I mean, I like the thing at the bottom there, 147 letters to the Chancellor by the Guardians. They've kept everything. Therefore, it's really interesting that there is no sign of a charter as such. There's no confirmation of land or office in perpetuity. So we know what the Guardians were issuing, and this was one thing they did not have the power to do, was to issue a charter. But we know that William Wallace issued a charter. And the reason is, once you think it through, is actually quite simple. It is that when the Guardians, the 7 and then later 6, ultimately 4 Guardians, were governing, they were not governing in the name of an inaugurated king. William Wallace was. He was governing in the name of John Balliol, who had been inaugurated king in 1292. So that's a bit of a technical thing, but it does mean that William Wallace was, as Guardian, was doing everything that a king could do. Call Parliament, play as part of the appointment of a Bishop of St Andrews, lead armies, and issue charters. So from that point of view, the English royal government perspective, you could understand why they would think he was wanting to call himself king. This, by the way, is the charter that he issued, and the bit in red makes it crystal clear that this is actually a charter giving something in perpetuity. Okay, that's me been through my 3 little discoveries, and there's so much more to say and above all discuss about all this, but I'm afraid that must wait for another time. So from medieval history, I will say cheerio and pass on to more modern times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Brune. Fascinating to hear of new information coming to light, showing that history is not necessarily fixed, as many of us were going to turn to the effect of the film Braveheart. And for that, I'd love to hand over to David Martin Jones, who's Professor of Film Studies at the University of Glasgow.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much to Ken Thompson for the invitation to speak at this celebration, and also to Katie Mackay for the help in the preparation of it. So I'm here today to talk about Braveheart and screen tourism in Scotland. So the focus will be as much Braveheart from 95 as it will be the Braveheart effect from 1997, and indeed the relationship between these things and heritage. When I lecture in film studies at Glasgow, screen tourism is a subject close to my heart, so I thought I'd briefly introduce what that is initially. This term, screen tourism, refers to tourism which is connected to films or television shows. I suppose that's fairly obvious. And this very often means visitors to locations which people have seen on screen. But it can also include some other forms, such as visitors to festivals, like the Edinburgh International Film Festival is a place for screen tourism. People looking to bump into celebrities by hanging around near their location shoots. That one's called set jetting. People following city film maps or on star tours. People visiting studios, such as the Warner Brothers Harry Potter studio tour near London. There are other studio tours. Or in the case today, visitors to sites linked to the story of the film, especially heritage sites, even if the site did not feature in the film, which I think is quite fascinating. And whilst books have been written about Braveheart indicating its cultural importance for Scotland, and here I would heartily recommend Colin MacArthur's wonderful Brigadoon, Braveheart and the Scots from 2003, the story of Braveheart's impact on screen tourism in Scotland is one which I believe should also be told. I think it has a great resonance for how we understand Scotland's heritage sites and the relationships with different communities and the relationships they have with these sites. So my aim today is to explore the link between what we see in the movies and our tourism habits. And I'm going to suggest that we understand screen tourism as a kind of heritage tourism. And in this way, I think we can understand something very important about the link between the movie Braveheart and the Wallace Monument. Now, I sort of appreciate immediately that this sounds very counterintuitive. Films and TV shows are ephemeral. They come and they go. With only a very few exceptions, they are of the moment. And historically, films may tell a story which is, shall we say, a little different from the historical record. And indeed, this is the fun of watching films. After all, they're films, they're not history books. Whereas a heritage site, like the Wallace Monument, is the exact opposite of this. So on the other hand, we have a solid material presence in the physical and cultural landscape. Compared to a film's ephemerality, it's much more permanent, and historically, such sites tend to preserve a much closer link to the historical record. After all, we're here today listening to Dovitt telling us precisely that. And yet we're also here today to talk about Braveheart and the Wallace Monument. So how are we to understand the link between these two very different things? What should we make indeed of the Braveheart effect in terms of heritage? So I will suggest for your consideration, see what you think, that it is around heritage that this link becomes clear. And we can see this if we can think about, firstly, so the first thing I'll talk about today, the Scottish diaspora, and perhaps there are people in the audience today who consider themselves a part of that, perhaps. And secondly, people in Scotland, I suppose I would say, or people in Scotland in the UK, who could also be considered screen tourists, who are also, to a degree, heritage tourists. But before we turn to these 2 points, let's refresh our memories regarding the Braveheart effect and what that was. In recent years, there's been a lot of buzz around the Outlander effect. As doubtless everybody knows, this refers to the television show Outlander, based on the novels by Diana Gabaldon. These have been on our screens since about 2014. And like Braveheart before it, Outlander is a racy costume drama. In fact, it's incredibly racy at times, and it's mostly set in the 18th century, mostly. And the term Outlander effect refers to the impact of this TV show produced in Scotland and the impact it's had on Scotland. And this ranges across everything from an increased interest in learning the Gaelic language to the rise in visitor numbers to the heritage sites where the show has been filmed. But of course, the term Outlander effect is a nod to the earlier term, the Braveheart effect. So in true Outlander style, let's travel back in time to the late 90s, or as we say in film circles, let's flash back. The term Braveheart effect was coined to summarise the findings of a report by the Hydra Associates. And this so-called Hydra report, as it became known, of 97, indicated statistically that a film like Braveheart, and the report also included contemporaries you may remember like Rob Roy of Loch Ness, could prompt a huge increase in visitor numbers. The report notes especially that the Wallace Monument saw a rise in visitors in 1995 of over 50% on the previous year, and of the visitors surveyed, overall, 49% had seen Braveheart, which is a much higher figure than you would expect of the general population. And this, even though, as we know, much of Braveheart was filmed in Ireland, and it does not feature the Wallace Monument for very obvious reasons. The report also analysed the effectiveness of the campaign to market Stirling as a Braveheart country. This was a sort of co-production, if you like, between what is now Visit Scotland, 20th Century Fox and other partners. And this included bringing the premiere of the film to Stirling, the reason we're all here today, of course. And the Braveheart effect indicated, in short, the importance of film and TV for what had already become termed Scotland's brand identity. And there's a book about this from 95, the same year, called Scotland the Brand. So there it is, written by David McCrone and 2 co-authors. Now, Scotland had probably, very likely, already enjoyed a lot of screen tourism before that, following films like Whiskey Galore from the late 40s, The Wicker Man in the 70s, Local Hero in the 80s. But now things were formally recognised. We had statistics. And the revenue involved was significant. The Braveheart effect was thought to be worth between 7 million and 15 million of tourist revenue at that time. So not surprisingly, the Hydra report recommended that Scottish tourist authorities should liaise with film production and distribution companies to coordinate marketing campaigns, and tourist authorities should also engage in their own promotional activities, such as the production of movie maps. And since then, Scotland has actively promoted screen tourism in partnerships, just like the report suggested. For example, since Braveheart, Visit Scotland has worked closely on such milestones as the Da Vinci Code in 2006, on which they collaborated with Sony Pictures Entertainment on the marketing of the film's locations, and again, a little bit later, Disney Pixar's animated film Brave from 2012, which Visit Scotland also helped market and indeed helped fund. And of course, amongst many others since then, we now also have Outlander. And perhaps I think in the audience tonight is Jenny Steele of Visit Scotland, who has sort of provided the link between all these events and also has helped scholars like me understand what's going on. As a result of this, film and television have now become as integral to Scotland, the brand, as tartan, shortbread, castles and ceilidhs, or perhaps the more fine-tuned comparison is as integral as, I've lost my point, there it is, art, architecture and literature. So scholarly works and journalism on screen tourism all around the world still mentions the Braveheart, and it often pulls me up short when I'm reading a piece about screen tourism in Iceland or Norway or New Zealand, and suddenly it says the Braveheart effect. And it's a sort of shorthand used to explain the phenomenon I've been talking about. So Scotland really seems to be a leader in this field globally. And this global knowledge of the Braveheart effect introduces the first of the 2 points I want to make. Its importance internationally for the Scottish diaspora. So this is the first of my 2 points, and then I shall finish. So firstly, then the diaspora. Braveheart, we might say, is not so concerned with history as it is with the story of history. As I said, it's a film, it's not a history book, so we expect a ripping yarn. Besides, Braveheart does tell a story of history in a way that's very recognisable to a film studies scholars, and especially the student of screen tourism. Braveheart represents Scotland in much the same way that, say, Brigadoon from 1954 previously did, representing Scotland for US viewers, or John Ford's The Quiet Man from 1952, representing Ireland for US viewers. A more recent example would be Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, this sumptuous film from 2000, and its much contested depiction of ancient China. So all these films show a fictionalised version of a national past, whether it's Scotland, Ireland, or China. And this is a fictional past constructed specifically to appeal to audiences who may feel a strong connection to these national pasts, even if they've never lived in these countries. This is clearly the diaspora. And the size of this demographic for Scotland was amply illustrated by Homecoming Scotland. And films like Braveheart depict a diasporic dream of Scotland. Scotland remembered in a certain way in the diaspora perhaps, in stories handed down orally, partly mythologised, but intended to stir a sense of pride and belonging in a land of origin. So Braveheart's view of Scotland's medieval history seems somehow to relate to Scotland's 18th century history and how it's been depicted at times as a kind of simplified story of imperial oppression. This is why Braveheart's plot was so easily recycled in one of Mel Gibson's next films, The Patriot from 2000, about the US War of Independence against the British Empire. And this later film's appeal was similarly to a US audience's sense of its European settler colonist heritage. The same appeal now is currently on display in the latest season of Outlander, as the Scottish characters in the New World make their way to settle in 18th century North America just ahead of the Revolution. So this brings us to the end of the first point. I've spoken about how Braveheart appeals to the Scottish diaspora in North America or elsewhere, and how it speaks to an imagined sense of belonging or heritage. So visiting Scotland in the wake of Braveheart, diasporic screen tourism, I suggest to you, is thus a form of heritage tourism. It's an attempt to seek an imagined root in Scotland, even if this attachment is perhaps one kept alive in a partly mythologised history. And this is the appeal of Braveheart, its ability to attract screen tourists who are also heritage tourists. But what is the appeal to people in Scotland? How does Braveheart affect our sense of our own heritage? And this is the second and the final point. When we discuss screen tourism, it's easy to lose sight of the importance of the residents of the nation itself, perhaps the UK more broadly, as visitors to Scotland's heritage sites. And the pandemic, although it's hit tourism hard, may well mean a renewed interest in our own heritage as we partake of more staycations. So screen tourism to a site like the Wallace Monument in the wake of a Braveheart or an Outlander can also be a form of heritage tourism for Scotland's inhabitants. The film or television show does much to keep heritage alive for Scotland's residents in this way. It rejuvenates our sense of connection to this heritage. It brings it alive once more. And this is very easy to explain. What are the chances that I could persuade my 6-year-old to leave the warm car and run with me through the pelting rain from the car park up the muddy path to catch a glimpse of the architectural marvel that is the Glenfinnan Viaduct? I suspect my chances are very slim indeed. But what are the chances that I can persuade her to make the same rainy dash to see the route of the Hogwarts Express? Yes, I suspect my chances are much greater. More seriously, and perhaps more on topic, why are we here tonight? We're here to learn about William Wallace. Yes, but why are we here tonight? What prompts us and what frames our engagement with the Wallace Monument? Well, of course, it's Braveheart. The importance of film and television in this respect became very clear to me on 2 occasions when I was lucky enough to work with colleagues in other sectors to help bring to the surface knowledge of Scotland's cinematic past. Firstly, with Education Scotland, on a project led by my colleague Dovitt, to produce a set of teaching materials for a curriculum for excellence on screen tourism and heritage. And this emphasised how film and television works can frame visits to our heritage sites, keeping them alive for the new generation. And secondly, with Visit Scotland on their tourism guide, Set in Scotland, a film fans Odyssey. And here is a copy. There it is. Many of you may have a copy of this. The picture of Daniel Craig on the cover may have enticed you to pick it up. Daniel Craig in Glencoe from the James Bond movie Skyfall. Still freely available online from the Visit Scotland website. Now, this publication celebrated how rich the history of cinematic Scotland is, just how many memorable films that have been made here, and that we can all easily visit those locations where they were filmed. And as you might imagine, Braveheart and the Wallace Monument have their own dedicated section. The guide then replicates what the films themselves do, but on a broader scale. Celebrating all the films which constitute Scotland's cinematic heritage, the guide, like the films themselves, gives us a frame through which to relate to Scotland's heritage. So film, just like TV, literature, art, architecture, determines how we experience heritage and how we relate to our own past in the present. So to round off, as noted at the start, films come and go. They're ephemeral. Just as heritage sites don't, they stay and they belong. So it may seem counterintuitive to think that screen tourism is a form of heritage tourism. But films provide us with new frames through which to see the heritage anew. And in this sense, screen tourism is indeed a form of heritage tourism, just as art tourism or literary tourism is. Only now it's not a Sir Walter Scott novel providing the frame through which we initially enter, it's a film like Braveheart. And this then has brought us back to our starting point of the need to realise the important link between a film like Braveheart and a heritage site like the Wallace Monument. The one, after all, has led us directly to the other tonight.